Good morning. My name is Richard Bynum, and I'm the president of PNC Bank in Greater Washington. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Lincoln Theater this morning for what I know is going to be a fantastic event. The African American story is the quintessential American story. It's rich, it's deep, and it's invested in every facet of what has made America grow. For our employees and guests who've attended our Black History Month events in the past, you'll know that they've run the gamut. We've been pleased to hear from civil rights leaders like Julian Bond and Menagene Brown Trickey, one of the Little Rock Nine. We've heard from those who've helped preserve and honor Black history like Dr. Khalil Muhammad, who at the time was the director of the Schomburg Center in New York and is today the professor of history, race and culture and public policy at Harvard University. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, the celebrated author and contributing editor for The Atlantic. We've also celebrated Black history right here in our backyard by focusing on the roles that African Americans have played to make DC the economic and cultural place that it is, as well as celebrating the history of Black Broadway right here on U Street. Our program this morning promises to provide another dynamic view of African American history. This morning, thanks to a call from our friend Abby Fenton at Whitman-Walker Health, we have the opportunity to co-present a program honoring the legacy of Max Robinson, a trailblazing African American in the media industry right here first in DC and then nationally on ABC World News tonight. I want to thank Abby and Whitman-Walker Health Executive Don Blanchard for inviting us to be part of this exciting morning. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Don so that he can introduce you to our panelists. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. What a beautiful morning. It's amazing what the sun and some warm weather can do to bring us to life, huh? A few remarks for you. I want to first thank Richard and the entire PNC team for partnering with Whitman-Walker on this event. Your support made this event possible, and we're forever grateful. I also want to recognize Lincoln Theater, and as well as Abby Fenton and our team for putting this event together, and obviously for all of you to come out and join us this morning. I next want to personally thank Maureen, Mark, and Michael, and the Robinson extended family for being here with us today. That really brings this whole thing. We're grateful that you're going to share your experiences, but also keep the spirit of Max with us in the room today. And please know you're always a member of Whitman-Walker's extended family. Whitman-Walker's North Star has been unwavering for 40 years. And that's pretty simple. It's health is a matter of social justice and equality. And yet, there's a few areas where we just have not yet progressed enough, and none more has been in race and racial equity. We have a lot of work to do in this area, particularly around health and well-being for Black communities, especially east of the Anacostia River. That is our collective work moving forward, and we will need every one of your help in the days and weeks ahead. Second, Max Robinson, like so many others that we lost to AIDS, was a casualty not only of AIDS itself, but also the epidemic of silent stigma, racism, and the shame that surrounded it. Today, we are still fighting those very same forces that devastate Black communities all across this region. The fight is not over, it's not done, and we will need the best of you every day going forward. On a personal note, I regret that I never had an opportunity to meet Max. I moved to Washington, D.C. just 5 months before Max passed away of AIDS-related complications. I can only imagine what an amazing voice he would be against racism and inequity today, and how much of a supporter he could be to all of us in community. So as we begin today's program, it seems only fitting for me to share with you a Max quote that's on the Elizabeth Taylor Medical Center building just a few blocks away here on 14th Street. It goes like this. I remember once someone saying to me that I wasn't a team player. And I said, I'd be happy to play on the team if the rules were not structured against me and my people. Once again, thank you for being with us today, to PNC Bank for all of their support. It's now my sincere pleasure to introduce Mark Robinson, Maureen Bunyan, Gordon Peterson, and Bruce Johnson, who will make up our panel. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. How does this work, Bruce? You talk into this end?
Yes.
We are here, as you know, to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Whitman-Walker, which is doing such wonderful work in this community. And also the 25th anniversary of the Max Robinson Center. Max died at Howard University Hospital on December 20th, 1988. He was 49 years of age. Max was a pioneer in broadcast journalism. He was the first African-American anchor in the nation's capital, first black network anchor, and the people on this stage knew Max very well. By the way, Clarence Page, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Chicago Tribune columnist, was supposed to be with us. However, the flu has taken him down. Sorry to say that, but we'll carry on without him. We're here to share our memories of Max with you so that those of you who did not know him will learn to know him, and those of you who do remember him will remember his contributions to our national life. So now meet Max's son, Mark Robinson, currently the editorial cartoonist and city editor at the Montgomery County Sentinel. And now two other pioneers of journalism, my old friend, former colleague Maureen Bunyan, who has had I think they know you. Maureen has had a distinguished career in broadcast journalism, as you know. She's also a founder and board member of the National Women's Media Foundation, a founder of the National Association of Black Journalists, as Max Robinson was, member of the Hall of Fame of the Society of Professional Journalists. And Maureen, who was born in Aruba, has also been knighted by the Dutch government. So when you hear Bruce and I refer to her as Lady Mo, you'll know why. Bruce Johnson, another great old friend, former colleague, one of the nation's Bruce is one of the nation's premier urban reporters. He has won so many Emmys for his work, we've lost count. He's also a member of the Society of Professional Journalists Hall of Fame, and the author of Heart to Heart, which chronicles the stories of 11 young heart attack survivors, including Bruce Johnson. For the record, after his heart attack, Bruce ran the Marine Corps Marathon. This was after the heart attack. When I heard he was running the marathon, it almost gave me a heart attack. You should have more respect for your elders. Mark, let me start with you, and let's put up, can we put up Mark's, there it is, I like that, okay. Mark, this is about your father's first foray into television in Portsmouth, Virginia, I believe in 1958. The viewers could hear your father, but they couldn't see him, right, Mark?
Right. He would basically read the news from behind a slide, and this was in Portsmouth, Virginia. And I'd heard this story. Some of these stories, some stories you find out personally, sometimes you find them out by reading TV Guide, because that's where I first found out about the story, and confirmed it from my dad later, that he was basically reading the news from behind a slide that said, the call letters of the station and news. And then finally, one day he decided to take the slide away so that they would see who was delivering the news. And the next day he was fired. And his favorite thing he always liked to say about that was that in 1959, Portsmouth, Virginia just wasn't ready for color television.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. Well, in 1965, Max Robinson came to Washington. He was hired as a production assistant at Channel 9, then WTOP-TV, which was owned by the Washington Post, CBS affiliate here. They hired Max for $50 a week, and he said the standard rate was $75 a week, but they paid him $50. And then when they promoted him to reporter photographer, he made $100 a week. Everybody else was making like $150, $160. According to Lisa Page, who wrote about Max in the Washingtonian about 10 years after his death, Max used to call that the black tax. In 1966, Channel 4, WRC-TV, the NBC-owned station in Washington, hired Max as a reporter. He was his first black reporter over there. He won a number of, now remember, 68 were the riots here in Washington. He won a number of awards, including a national Emmy for a series on Anacostia, which he called The Other Washington, which was a perfect title. Then in 1969, Max returned to Channel 9, first as a reporter and then as a noon anchor. And in 1971, our boss, Jim Snyder, who hired Maureen Bruce and me, put Max at the anchor deck, making him the first black anchor in the nation. And he also became a national role model and a mentor, Maureen, right?
That's right. Max, one of the characteristics of Max, both in the newsroom and outside the newsroom, was he was a race man. He was extremely concerned about the issues facing people of color, especially the black community in Washington, D.C., and he was not afraid to share his thoughts and to stand up and challenge any racism that he saw at work as well as outside. And I think that's one of the things that endeared him so much to the audiences. But he didn't take any nonsense, and he was not afraid to speak up. And that was a time when a lot of black journalists were very tentative about their positions because most of us were brand new, new to our work, and we walked a narrow line between speaking for ourselves, speaking for people like us, and just doing our jobs and keeping quiet so we could get ahead. Max didn't hesitate to be an advocate for all of us.
Bruce?
I can't imagine the pressure that Max Robinson was constantly under. I came to Washington in 1976, and Max Robinson, Gordon Peterson, Bob Strickland, Maureen Bunyan, J.C. Hayward were already in place. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven because the station I came from, I was only black on air, only black in the newsroom. And I came here and I saw all of these other people who were just so far better than me. And at the top was Max Robinson, and almost godlike, almost from the beginning. I'll never forget the time that I was causing a lot of hell out here in the city. I was uncovering stories, corruption, and people stealing, and blah, blah, blah. And some of the leaders in the town were about ready to run me out of here and send me back to Cincinnati. And I'll never recall, and just give you some insight as to the kind of things Maureen was talking about. Some of them went to Max Robinson. I can call names too. And they said, what is it with this guy? He needs to get with the program. And Max said to them, I'm gonna clean it up a little bit, okay? Leave him alone. If you weren't effing up, he wouldn't have anything to report. Gordon?
You know, for the record, before Jim Snyder put Max and me together, I'd never anchored a television news broadcast. I mean, I came to Washington to cover the streets, anti-war demonstrations, civil rights, and so forth. I didn't have the slightest idea what I was doing. But thanks to the generosity of Max and the skill and patience of producers like Brian Healy and Martin Clancy and John Baker, I managed to get through it without destroying my television career before it began. I think we have a shot of Max and me, and oh, there we are. Yeah, there we are. That set was really pretty crummy. You know what I mean? They spent about $40 on it, I think. And we had these rickety chairs. You remember that chair? He had to sit on a pillow because of the thing. And we didn't have teleprompters. We wrote our own stuff, which was fine, but we didn't have teleprompters. When they finally got teleprompters, which were very primitive, it was a belt, and they would glue the script together, and nobody could figure it out because it was always the wrong copy. So Max and I had a rule. We had great floor directors, Laurie Smith, who now Laurie Smith Johnson was one, Ernie Bauer was another one. But Max and I, but the others weren't so good. Max and I had a rule: always go on the red light on the camera and never trust the teleprompter. I think we have a shot of Max and me and Warner Wolf are. Oh, there we are. There we are. Jim Snyder had built a great news team here, which included Maureen and Bruce, and before long we were hitting it out of the ballpark. Max and you were founding members of the NABG, right? Tell us about that.
Yes, Gordon. Well, you know, after the 60s and as the 70s started, a lot of African Americans who were in professional positions and who wanted to become professions in whatever their fields, law, medicine, etc. There was finally a critical mass of people available to start trade associations and groups. And in the mid-70s, if you go back and look at the histories of many African American professional groups, you will see that they were created in the mid-70s. The National Association of Black Journalists was one of those groups. It was founded in 1975. But before 75, many of us who, across the country, used to have meetings to cry on each other's shoulders about what was wrong with our jobs and et cetera. And Max was one of the people in Washington who was at the forefront. Max and I think some of our other founders we gathered together and we spoke as a group. We learned how to speak as a group, and we learned how to help each other and support each other, and also how to speak out in the newsroom as well as outside the newsroom about what was happening in newsrooms regarding hiring of people of color as well as the coverage of stories of people of color. Max opened his home, and it was the gathering place for those of us in Washington to come together to talk about these issues. So we were part of a group of groups around the country. Philadelphia had one, Chicago had one, and we were the nucleus, the beginning of a national organization which was formally created in 1975, the National Association of Black Journalists. And I know, I think without Max, I don't know if we in Washington would have had the willpower to move forward. Because as I said earlier, a lot of people were very tentative. A lot of people of color, journalists of color, were very tentative. And some people didn't want to create an organization because they thought it would be too threatening. Some people thought that it would affect their jobs, and it did. Some people actually lost their jobs because they dared to be part of creating this group. But Max made a tremendous contribution to it. The other thing, too, is that Max was not only a great anchor person, he had the charisma, he had the fabulous voice, the good looks, and authority on camera, but he also had it in person. So he could influence people one-to-one, as well as in front of groups in person. And he had a big, big impact on all of us.
And he had a great sense of humor, didn't he, Mark?
Oh, yeah. Yes. You wouldn't come across if you're looking at him on camera because, of course, he's reading the news, he's being very serious. But when the cameras were off, that's when he could be as goofy as anybody. And I think that's where we connected because that's something that me and my siblings share. Is that we're all kind of goofy. And in fact, me, my sister Maureen's in the audience, and my brother Michael's in the audience, and we all did Max Robinson impressions. So it was always going, "How you doing?" And we were always just amazed because, you know, we'd be coming from the country, and first off, we were amazed that, ooh, wow, nice city, everything's so shiny. But then it's like people would just like talk to our dad, like, "Hey Max, how you doing?" He's like, "How you doing?" "You know that guy?" "Never saw him before." and it was like that. I mean, we were once treated to, you know, his impression of doing the funky turkey during Christmas vacation. I mean, he could be really, really funny. And and we just enjoyed that.
Now, Bruce Johnson, immediately after joining Channel 9, covered the district like a vacuum cleaner. But I want you to talk a little bit about the Hanafi Muslim takeover of those 3 buildings in D.C. and the taking of hostages in 1977. Tell us about, you covered that. Tell us about your role.
Yeah, I forget what day it was, or even the date, but we were all headed up toward the Wilson building. It was called the district building at the time. Sterling Tucker was council chairman, the city's first elected chairman. He was holding a press conference. We were headed there. The photographer was P.D. Shiflett, and I'll never forget that. And we heard, this was before cell phones, you know, this sort of thing, but we had these transistor radios or whatever they looked like. We heard on the way down commotion at the district building. By the time we got in there, Maurice Williams, young reporter from WHUR, Howard University grad, had been shot. Steve, I forget his last name, worked for the Afro, was with him on the elevator coming up. Fast forward, they took over 3 buildings, B'nai B'rith, the district building, what am I missing?
Marion Barry got shot.
And the Islamic Center.
Islamic Center.
Yeah, Islamic Center. And Marion Barry had been shot, hit with some pellets of shotgun as he was coming into the hallway of the district building. There was a council hearing going on at the time. The city was under siege. I think we reflect back and we call it one of the first terrorist acts, I mean, that we knew. We were all going live, and even going live back then was so new. I remember sharing a truck with Lee Thornton of CBS News. I think it was the first time I ever went live here. Make a long story short, while everything's on lockdown, there were a bunch of people back in the council chambers, and Chairman Arrington Dixon was with them, and they couldn't get out, and so they were, Alan Grip worked for TOP Radio, he was communicating by phone. It was an incredible, incredible scene. Ike Fullwood, the late Ike Fullwood, who went on to become police chief, and Richard Pennington was a sergeant at the time. I recall those guys going up into the 5th floor and emptying their guns. I mean, there was a shootout up there. And Councilmember Willie Hardy coming out and feigning and that sort of thing. Fast forward, the leader of the Hanafis, he decides to call who else?
Abdul Khalis.
Yeah. By the way, I live within a stone's throw from the Hanafi house right now. And every time I'm walking the dog, I pass by there, I look, because you just don't forget those kind of things. He calls Max Robinson. Who else would you call? Max was the man. Knew Max on a first-name basis. And he laid out their demands. Won't give you all the specifics. And Max is talking to him on the phone. I kind of figured he was trying to negotiate. Let's find out what his demands are and stuff. And his demands were just, outrageous, something, police were not going to meet. Eventually it ended,
Well, Maureen, you'll remember this. What I remember most vividly is Max going out on the street with a photographer, looking into the camera and making an impassioned plea directly to Khalis to show some compassion by releasing the hostages, which he did, Maureen.
Yes. Part of the context of this is the sort of social context is that the Hanafi sect was angry about another sect that they felt had insulted them and abused them. And they reached out, or should we say they reached out to Max, because Max was the most prominent and most respected African-American journalist on the air here. And the Hanafi sect was a very small sect. The people who did this were a small group of people. And in those days, it was not uncommon for people of color who were in trouble with the law in one way or another to contact black journalists in their communities and to ask those journalists not only to cover the story and to get their part of the story out, but also to negotiate when negotiations were necessary. And this was a situation in which the Hanafis obviously were very angry. They'd taken over 3 major buildings. They'd shot several people and killed one. So they knew what a horrible position they were in. And it was really, a perverse tribute to Max that they wanted him to negotiate for them. Because they knew Max had the authority, Max had the attention of the public, and that Max was credible and trustworthy. And that's something, we don't ever want to see situations like that take place. But when they did take place, Black journalists like Max played a very important role in bringing peace and bringing to an end these types of violent outbursts. It's hard to imagine that happening today.
But I should also add this. I mean, that's one end, and that's one of the events that everybody saw, and it kind of sent Max on, to ABC Network, where they created this triumvirate, and they became great. But Max also got that call, or the 3 or 4 calls, or the 5 or 6 or the 10 calls per week from that person who couldn't pay the rent, from that person who was trying to raise money for this, from that pastor who was trying to get a speaker, for this, or from that dad, incarcerated, who wanted him to intervene and talk to my son about this. I know, because after Max was gone, we started getting those calls, and it's just such a heavy burden. So in addition to dealing with management and people taking over buildings and killing people, there's the little guy who also feels as though he can reach out and touch Max. I just want to say this, because at my old age, I tend to forget stuff. But Jim Vance and I were very, very close, at the end. And I'll never forget what Jim Vance once said about Max Robinson, which to me is the ultimate compliment. He says, "Bruce, I always feared that after Max Robinson left, that he would come back to town."
So here's where the story takes a turn. Could you put up the picture of Max and Frank Reynolds and Peter Jennings? I guess you can't. Okay, well, in any case, Max came to the attention of Roone Arledge, who was then the president of ABC News, after the Hanafi takeover. So he comes up with this triumvirate. He's going to put Frank Reynolds in Washington, which was Max's town. He's going to have Peter Jennings floating around, and he's going to have Max Robinson in Chicago, where you spent a lot of time with him, Mark. I never thought that arrangement would work. It seemed crazy. And I found out recently that the reason Arledge didn't put an anchor in New York was he didn't want to offend Barbara Walters, who had failed when she was working with Harry Reasoner, who was kind of mean to her. And he didn't want to offend her by putting another anchor up there. Well, Max should have been in Washington, Reynolds should have been in New York, and if they wanted to do a triumvirate, that's fine. In any case, the network experience for Max was not a happy one, Maureen.
No, I think Max is from Richmond. He grew up in Richmond, and he really knew this area. He knew Northern Virginia, he knew Washington, and he was very much at home. And I think that Chicago at that time, and still is, a huge city, sometimes cold, and I'm referring to the weather as well as its personality. And I think that was not a good fit for Max. I think he missed his friends here, and I don't think that he got the kind of support in Chicago, certainly from ABC, that he thought he deserved. I know of some stories that Max told about how he was, ignored at ABC in Chicago. And also, you have to remember that in the network system, the major television networks were all headquartered in New York. So if you wanted your voice to be heard, you could easily go to your boss's office in some building in New York. In Washington, the Washington bureaus were very powerful too. So when you were in Washington, you could also get your voice heard easily. But when you're out in the Midwest, in Chicago, that's not a center of news production. And that, I think, isolated Max and helped to dilute some of his power, certainly, and also helped to dilute his impact.
Let me tell you what Carl Bernstein said. Woodward and Bernstein, Watergate fame. Carl Bernstein was the ABC News bureau chief in Washington, D.C. in 1980 and 1981. What he said was that he told the Washington Post that Max was never treated as a participant in that broadcast. He was always treated as a mouth or a face. And the proof of that was in January 20th, 1980, Ronald Reagan is inaugurated, and the American hostages in Iran are released. Reynolds and Jennings handled that story. Max never handled. They didn't put him on the air. They didn't put him on. Well, you used to see him in Chicago at that point, Mark. What was his demeanor like?
Well, during that time, I did spend quite a bit of time in Chicago, but for the most part, I was growing up with my sister and brother in Amelia, Virginia, and we were watching him.
Yeah.
In Chicago on the news, and from our perspective and the perspective of everyone that we knew, it was just like, look at that, he's on the air. And he was just, by the sheer dint of just appearing and having the voice and the charisma and the presence, I think that really made an impression in terms of how he was seen in the news. But I also remember, a lot of times where he would be, shuttled off here and shuttled off there, but not really in the inner circle. He was always on the periphery, doing these live correspondence shots when he wasn't doing Chicago.
They were not playing to his strength. His strength was on the air, the Walter Cronkite role, basically. He wanted to be the first black Walter Cronkite, and he could have been. When Bill Russell came to the, Max was not the athlete in the family, his brother Randall was, but when Bill Russell came to the Boston Celtics, he had fought with his college coach all the way through, even though in 55 they had gone 28-1 and they won the NCAA title. But the coach would never let him play his game. He went to the Celtics, Auerbach had never seen him play, and he said, just play your own game. That's what should have been done with Max Robinson in Chicago, Bruce.
Yeah. Don't think for a second that race didn't have a big part in this. They picked Max because he was a star, he could help them, and for a brief period of time, that triumvirate of three anchors became number one. They knocked off CBS. But Max, if you talk to him, Max never got the support. He certainly never got the star treatment that you would expect of somebody in that position. Keep in mind, at the network level and even at the local level, producers, the behind-the-scenes people, have a lot of clout. They can make or break you. The scripts, the lines, who reads what, who leads with what. And Max was never given, the same opportunities. And I almost hate that word opportunity, because once you get there, it's not about opportunity anymore, it's about exposure. It's about where the producers decide you're gonna go. There was a time when Max, as an anchor in Chicago, was put in a car and sent out to cover local stories. He'd run into the local reporters. I mean, they had busted him down to that. That's a form of humiliation. That's the kind of thing that drives you crazy. Those are the kind of things you won't hear about. I'm glad you mentioned Bill Russell, because Bill Russell can tell the same kinds of stories, despite the fact he's got all those championships and what he did, for that organization. Bill Russell today is still an angry guy, because of how he's been treated by society. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, we mentioned the Hanafi house. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar bought that house, and gave that, to the Hanafis. You talk to him, and he will also talk about the difficulties he had being the first, being black. Again, I go back to what I said at the very beginning. I don't know how you get through that kind of thing. Most of us could not have survived that kind of pressure.
Russell, that 28-1 season, when they won the NCAA title, the Bay Area sports writers gave the title of best athlete to some white guy who came in, his team came in third. So anyway, at this point he's frustrated, and he makes a speech at Smith College about 3 weeks after January 20th. He says in part, "When Ronald Reagan was crowned and our hostages came home, there was an orgy of patriotism, the likes of which I've never seen in my young life, and I'm 41. And I must tell you that I watched from the sidelines because ABC elected not to include me in the coverage of their event, even though I'm the national anchor responsible for a good deal of the ratings at ABC. They have admitted it to me. So I had to ask the question, why am I being excluded? Max's answer was, in this patriotic fervor, black people would interfere with the process. Frustration, Mark,
Yeah.
and anger.
I just remember at that time, I think it hadn't really hit me until later when I reflected on it that he could have just as easily just taken the money, just, stayed quiet, but that was never my dad. I mean, he was always going to be the one that was going to kick down the door and, kick butt, take names. And he basically went out there and pointed to his own network as a source of problem with racism, which of course ticked off Roone Arledge. And to my understanding, he and Roone had it out because he's basically telling Roone, you don't understand what it's like to be black in America, which then inspired ABC to do an hour-long show with black correspondents called Black in America. So, I mean, I was just really always
But
impressed
I
by
think that was the beginning of the end, and he did develop some personal problems, Maureen.
And one other thing, Gordon, part of Bruce described the network of people, the group of people that surround someone like a Max Robinson in the newsroom. It's not only the producers, the writers, et cetera, the news director, it's also the people that you work with every single day on the set with you, your co-anchors. And one of the things that Max used to talk about was how he was treated by his co-anchors. Now here are three men who are supposed to be equal in terms of their status, in terms of the money that they're making, in terms of their value to a network, ABC network. And Max talked about how he was slighted, and I'm not going to give you any specifics because I don't remember specifics, but I know what they were, and I can imagine what they were, and you can imagine what they were. If you're sitting next to somebody every night, you're being paid a lot of money, they're being paid a lot of money, and they don't speak to you. There's no, hi, Bruce, how are you doing tonight? How was the holiday? Where'd you go on vacation? No small talk. It's cold, and you are treated like an interloper. That takes a toll on you. And if you then try to make up, if you're inclined to make up for it by being extra nice to that person next to you, then it's also demeaning to be in that position. And it's also demeaning to have to, if you do this, to go to your superiors to say, how are you going to say, oh, Frank Reynolds isn't nice to me? Or Peter Jennings isn't nice to me? No adult human being wants to do that. So that's part of the pressure that I think Max felt, and I know others have felt. And it's not necessarily a matter of race. I think there was a context of race where Max was concerned, but it's a matter of the people around you you're supposed to be part of a group, you're supposed to go forward as a group, but there are those who don't want to include you in the group, and I think that happened to Max.
You know, it's just a guess, and we won't know for sure, but I suspect that if Max was still with us and we're still in the news business, he would be the subject of a storm of tweets from the gentleman at 1600 Pennsylvania.
Twitter would be his best friend.
Just the feeling I have, Bruce.
He would have all the social media lined up, and he would be having a field day with, oh my goodness, with the Trump administration, I think it would be heaven.
I don't think we've said enough about Max's affection for the people behind the scenes, the producers and the production assistants and so forth. There were two Mike Murphys at Channel 9. There was Black Mike Murphy and White Mike Murphy.
That's what we
Mac-
called them. That's true.
Max
That's what we called them.
Max
That's
bought
how we
Black
told them-
Mike Murphy
told them
a
apart.
suit one time. We love Mike. He's a fabulous guy. By the way, the white Mike Murphy threw a management person into a potted plant one time, but that's another story. Anyway, but that was Max. He would, he paid attention.
Max, the other thing, I don't want to harp on the race thing, but one of the other mountains we had to climb, and again, if most of us were here, Max's mountains were way up here. You didn't have the support system, the backup. A lot of times, if you're having an issue on the job, it doesn't go your way, you can go home, you talk to Dad, right? Is it me or is it them? And Dad kind of lets you know, and Dad kind of gives you your expectations. There's some people that walk in the newsroom and the feeling is I can be all, that I want to be in here. There are others walk into the newsroom and we kind of feel like, okay, who's the top black guy in here? Okay, that's probably the bar for me. I'm not going to go much higher than that. With women, probably the same thing. You look around. Max didn't have, other than, other blacks, I think, and some progressive whites, didn't have the support system. The person could pull him aside, build him up, send him back in there. Most of the time when Max came into a gathering, he was the support system. I don't think I ever walked into Max's office and said to myself, oh man, he's got so much, going on. I don't think I'll bother him with this issue. No, I was the young guy in there. Max, I don't care what you're doing. This is important. Listen to me. He'd sit down and he'd listen. Or he'd say, okay, wait for me, because Max and Gordon would do the 11 o'clock news. Max would be like, wait for me when I get off and we'll go out and have a drink and talk about it. Big mistake on my part was like, okay, I'd wait and we'd go out and we'd have a drink and then another one and then another one and then another one. Make it home at some point in time, get into a lot of trouble, that sort of thing. And Max is like, we'll do that again tomorrow. And I'm like, no, we won't.
Hey, we were all juicing pretty good in those days.
That's right.
With the exception of Maureen, I would say. Yeah.
Except for
But he never took his eye off the ball. And in his final speech at Howard University, and by the way, he came to see you when he was sick, didn't he, Maureen?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
He had left Chicago, and I remember it was in the winter, and he called several of us up, including myself. I think he called J.C. Hayward, and wanted to come over. He came over to my house to talk, and he started telling me about some of the problems that he'd had, the personal problems, and that he was very sick. And it was a goodbye meeting. He came to say goodbye. And it was very, very sad, of course, as you can imagine. But he was extremely candid, and he also wanted me, and I think he wanted many of us to know that he loved us and that we were a part of his life, and that we had not been forgotten. And that was very important, certainly to me, and I know to others. And I think it was important to Max, because I think he genuinely respected us, and I think he genuinely felt in a way that he had disappointed us. And by coming to talk to us like that, he, I think, was able, I hope he was able to see that we were not disappointed and that we would continue supporting him no matter what. That was a few months before he died. He died in January, and I believe his visit to me was in November.
His friend Aaron Freeman took him to Washington, a very sick Max Robinson, to Washington for his final speech at Howard University. And a dying Max Robinson said this: this country remains a very racist country. I want to see my people with a chance. I want to see black people make it very clear it is a new day dawning, and that those of us who fought the good battle did not labor in vain. And he added to the students at Howard University, try to keep your integrity. The terrible thing about selling out is that you have nothing left. Don't ever forget that. And believe me, I know that in this country that once you have nothing left to sell, you are absolutely dispensable. Mark?
At the end, it was, of course, naturally, it was very difficult to see someone who you'd seen on television. I mean, he always towered over me as a kid, so I was used to looking up to him like some sort of demigod. And, you know, AIDS had reduced him. He had aged. He was 49 when he died. He looked like he was 70. But at the same time, he still did have his dignity. He still had his integrity. He, I don't know, he seemed to make peace with a lot. I'd read in an article that somebody had asked him, he'd never, you know, bemoaned his fate. He never said, "Why me?" And his response was, "Well, I never said why me when I was making all the money and,
Drinking
sitting
champagne,
at the
yeah.
top. So why should I say why me now?" And I was just glad to be able to make him laugh at the end, to be able to just to be there. I think that all of us were glad to be able to be there at the end to see him off. But I wish he were here today. I mean, because it's only natural. You want to say, hey, you'll never guess what happened to me today. Or to see, the things that we've achieved, so that he could watch his grandkids grow up. I mean, and I also miss the fact that there's not as much known about him, so that when Lester Holt, gets to the NBC Nightly News, certain factions are hailing him as the first black anchor on a nightly network news broadcast, and I'm going, no. And that's part of what inspired me to do the cartoon and to write other things, is because I just always wanted to make sure that people knew who he was and what he stood for. When I worked at Whitman-Walker long ago, at the suburban Maryland, they had established the Max Robinson Center. And there's nothing more surreal than hearing your parent's name referred to as a place, where suddenly it's like, I'm going to go over to Max Robinson. What? Oh. And so I started writing like an essay here or a poem here or a cartoon, just so to keep people aware of who he was and what he stood for. And, that's easy here in DC, because you can always find somebody who's like, oh yeah, I remember Max. And he really made a deep and lasting impression here, more so than any other place.
Not a week goes by that somebody doesn't say to me, and I remember you and Max and you and Maureen and you and Bruce. Bruce.
You can't let this event end without saying that you mentioned Bill Russell. Bill Russell, Hall of Famer, great guy, but he had some incredible players around him. I'm thinking Michael Jordan also. He had incredible players around him. You look at Golden State Warriors right now. That's an incredible team. Max had an incredible team around him, starting with his coach and general manager, Jim Snyder, who's a white guy, grew up blue-collar, Catholic, a hard ass. I mean, I was so afraid of this guy when I got here. But when I looked up and saw that the same fear that he put in me, he put in him and her and everybody else, maybe not Max, that was a little different nut to crack. And Jim would tell you that not everything is fair. There's Max and then there's you. He'd say things like that. And you grew to understand, because we all played different positions, okay? But these two sitting here, and there was J.C. Hayward, and then there was back then Henry Tenenbaum, Pat Collins, Mike Buchanan, Bob Strickland. I mean, and incredible photographers, Klein Mingle. I walked into that newsroom and I said to myself, and I never said to my wife, because I was young then, and I'm like, I'm not gonna make it. I'm not good enough. And I'll never forget the time when I got to the point where, okay, I'm gonna stay. I've at least found a niche for myself. And I went into Max and I was complaining that a story that I wanted to cover, a political story, they gave to Gordon Peterson. I'm like, oh, and Max looks at me and he says, well, he's got a right to compete for the story too. Bottom line, he put me in my place and let me know we're all competing, and that's what made this place so great. That's what made all those teams so great. We practice together, we compete, and we go out, and we like owned this town. They would the mayor would hold the press conference up until Channel 9 got there. I mean, if you had a story you wanted told, you called Channel 9, and that's why they called us the one and the only. And I don't think there'll ever be a team like that. And so I thank you guys. I mean, Maureen Bunyan, J.C. Hayward, I mean, they didn't like walk into a newsroom. They arrived in the newsroom. Maureen and I had lunch not long ago, and I wanted to have this lunch because I wanted to talk to her about the Me Too movement, okay? I wanted Maureen's take on this because she's the quiet, the strong one, and you never really knew what she was thinking, you know? You could never, and she put it in perspective for me, and I went out there and I kind of understood, and I'm trying to get her to do an interview with me for off script. I'm trying to get Gordon to do an interview. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, because don't let these guys leave town and go retire in Florida somewhere without getting their stories also, because they are two great individuals.
All right, thank you very much.
His impact on Washington, D.C. was huge because he was more than just a face and a voice. I mean, he was very much involved with the community. In terms of his contribution to journalism, I think that he really was not afraid to shine a light on the blight of racism, no matter where it was, even at his own network, when he felt that the powers that be were marginalizing him or others in his position.
This is the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Major conflagrations in our cities. The anniversary also of the Kerner Commission report, which outlined the inequality in American society, inequality of the races. And so it's a good moment to talk about people who made a difference in that era, in the late 60s and early 70s. And Max Robinson was one of those people who made a difference.